My boss tried to blame me for his mistake, but the video showed the truth. I always gave my all at work. I was the type to arrive before my shift started, to take on responsibilities that weren't even mine, all in the name of trust and commitment. I thought that by doing the right thing nothing could shake me, but it only took one serious mistake on an important project for everything to change. And the worst part? I was pointed out as the culprit by my own boss. What came next was a painful sequence of judgment, isolation, and a silent fight for justice. But it was also the beginning of something that would completely transform who I am. Today I carry scars but also strength, a voice, and pride in the woman I've become. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story to the end and comment with the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. From a young age, I was always the one who met deadlines ahead of schedule, who organized everything in color-coded spreadsheets, and who could barely relax on the weekend, thinking about what needed to be delivered on Monday. My name is Amy Johnson, I'm 34 years old, and I'm a project coordinator at Tech Solutions, a technology company based in Chicago. My office is the third on the left on the project management floor, where the windows filter the morning light as if time inside needed to be controlled. Between emails, timelines, and meetings, my routine was almost predictable, and I liked it that way. It was as if control kept me safe from the chaos I knew existed outside. My direct boss, Michael Brown, was always the kind of man who filled the room with his presence. Charismatic, elegant, articulate, but there was something in the way he acted that I could never quite figure out. He used to praise me in meetings and always said he trusted my precision, which made me feel valued. Maybe too much. Despite this, he maintained a reserved posture, never getting directly involved in the technical details. Perhaps that's why, when something went wrong, he knew exactly how to point the finger at others without implicating himself. That Monday, everything seemed the same. Coffee in the break room, colleagues laughing at old jokes, my computer updating tasks in the system. But Michael arrived earlier than usual, without his customary smile, and with a slight frown on his face. He didn't say good morning, he just walked straight past, entering his office and closing the door with a soft click. That set off a silent alarm in my head. It was as if something was about to happen, but I didn't know what. I thought about ignoring it. I went back to my tasks, reviewed the deliverables for Project X, checked the deadlines with the team, and prepared an updated report. Project X was one of the company's most strategic projects, with high visibility among the board of directors. I had been leading it for weeks, and everything was running on schedule. I took a deep breath, trying to push away the strange feeling Michael's behavior had left. But it remained there, like a stubborn shadow in the corners of the room. But there was something strange in Michael's eyes that Monday. The first meeting of the week was scheduled for 9 o'clock sharp. I walked into the conference room and found the familiar faces of Jessica, John, and a few other area managers. Michael was at the head of the table, already flipping through the reports I had printed. He made no comment on them, just motioned for us to begin. I presented the progress of Project X, pointed out future risks, and delivered updated estimates based on the previous week's data. As I spoke, I noticed Michael wasn't looking at me as he usually did. His eyes seemed to wander, as if he were far away or deliberating something he couldn't say out loud. When I finished, there was a brief silence before he leaned forward. He said he had complete faith in my leadership and that, for that reason, Project X was under my full responsibility from that moment on. His eyes fixed on mine caused me an inexplicable discomfort. Was it a compliment? A test? A trap? This wasn't typical of him. He always shared decisions, maintaining a certain distance from operations. I was surprised, but I thanked him for his confidence, although a part of me was already on alert. Jessica, sitting next to me, shot a quick glance in my direction, as if she had also sensed something was off. It didn't make sense. Why now, on this particular project, would he decide to give me so much autonomy? I didn't have time to reflect much, as the meeting continued with other, less urgent topics. But my mind was already elsewhere. I mentally reviewed every detail of Project X, trying to find a loose end, something that would justify his unusual behavior. But everything seemed under control, at least for now. Michael ended the meeting with a slight smile, thanking everyone for their hard work. When he said, "I have complete faith in you," I felt a chill run down my spine. 3 days later, everything fell apart. An email sent by the quality assurance team pointed out a serious error in the Project X timeline. Dates incompatible with the defined milestones, which could compromise deliveries to a strategic client. I was called into an emergency meeting with the entire board. I entered the room with reports in hand and my heart in my throat. Michael was already there, talking quietly with Susan and Robert. No one would look me in the eye. I started to explain that the files I had were consistent with the timeline approved in the last meeting, but Michael interrupted me before I could finish. He said, in a restrained manner, that he had identified the error, and that it was, unfortunately, the responsibility of project coordination. In other words, my responsibility. I felt the floor disappear from under my feet. This couldn't be happening. I opened my laptop, showed the version saved in the system, the date of the last modification. All the records were there. But it was as if no one else could see them. Jessica looked at me in silence. John frowned. Susan's face was unreadable. I felt like I was in a nightmare, trapped inside a distorted version of reality. And the worst part, I didn't know what had happened. How had that data been changed? It was then that I realized the real game. Michael wasn't surprised. He knew about the error even before the quality team pointed it out. He was prepared. He was setting me up. This wasn't a common mistake. It was a carefully laid trap. And I, naive with my sense of justice, had walked right into it. Everything inside me screamed for justice, but no one seemed to be listening. Everyone looked at me, and the world seemed to stop for a moment. Michael cleared his throat, looked at me and said, "It was Amy." I went back to my desk with my breath caught in my chest. My fingers trembled as I reviewed the original timeline line by line. Every piece of data, every delivery, every adjustment had been recorded with precision. I checked the sent emails, the minutes of the previous meeting, the screenshots of approvals. Everything was there, exactly as I remembered. I started to doubt myself, after being told so many times that I had made a mistake. But the data brought me back to my senses. I opened the company's system again, and located the previous versions of the document. The one available now was different from the one I remembered sending. Someone had changed the dates but kept my digital signature. It was subtle, but enough to compromise the project. My eyes filled with tears, but I didn't let them fall. I needed to stay strong. I needed to understand what had really happened. I requested access to the backup area, but it was restricted. Only IT and the managers had full permission. Desperation began to creep in, silent and cruel. What if no one wanted to listen? What if this was really the end of my career? Still, something inside me refused to accept the blame. This hadn't come from me. I knew it. I felt it. I went through my local files and every item that could prove the true version. I compared the old screenshots with the current documents and marked the differences. My records were intact, in perfect order, as they had always been. And that's what made me certain that something bigger was happening behind this accusation. There were no errors in my records. None. The boardroom felt colder than usual. I was called back in to clarify the situation, but the atmosphere was different. No one greeted me. Michael sat like a distant spectator, as if he had no responsibility at all. When I started to speak, I felt the weight of their gazes on me. Inquisitive, impatient, suspicious. Every word seemed to hit an invisible wall. I showed the files I managed to save, the evidence of what I had done, but the reaction was minimal. Robert, the CEO, just took notes in his notebook without looking up. Susan, who had been a more neutral figure until then, averted her eyes. That hurt more than any direct reprimand. It was as if my guilt had already been decided, and I was just playing a decorative role. I tried to argue, to insist that the data had been modified, that something didn't add up, but no one gave me time. Michael suggested that perhaps, due to being overworked, I had confused the versions. An understandable human error according to him. A lapse in attention. Those were his words. I swallowed hard. It was so calculated it made me sick to my stomach. He was putting on a perfect performance. I left the room with a knot in my stomach, feeling the pitying glances of the few colleagues who passed me in the hallway. I didn't know what was worse, the doubt in their eyes or the indifference of the board. I began to realize that, in this place, The truth mattered less than the official narrative. And at that moment I was the wrong character in this story. Susan averted her gaze, and Robert just jotted something down in his notebook. That night, I took my laptop home. I spent hours analyzing the files, trying to understand how they had been altered. I used metadata reading software, and that's when I noticed something strange. The version of the document that incriminated me had an edit date later than my last modification, but my digital signature was still listed as the author. This was only possible if someone with advanced access had manipulated the system. I thought about who would have that permission. The list was short. Michael was at the top. I started cross-referencing login times, actions on the files, and moments when the server registered changes. Apparently, someone accessed the document on Wednesday morning at 2:17 a.m., an unusual, suspicious time, and it coincided with a period when Michael was alone at the company, according to informal reports from the night security guard. It was too much to be a coincidence. But I still didn't have direct proof, only fragments. Even so, it ignited a fury mixed with determination in me. It wasn't just about the mistake. It was about what he was willing to do to protect himself. And me? Was I just going to be another casualty in the path of someone who only cared about his own image? I went back to the internal system and took screenshots of everything I could, including access logs. My plan was simple. Gather everything into a technical dossier and try to present it to Susan, who might still have some empathy. But I knew that time was against me. And more than that, that Michael was fast and smart. If he had started covering his tracks, soon everything would be irretrievable. The metadata didn't add up. Something was wrong. If I didn't find proof, my career would be over. In the days that followed, the work environment became a minefield. My colleagues started avoiding eye contact, and even the simplest greetings disappeared. I felt the distance materialize in small gestures, the invitation for coffee that never came, the silent group chats, the doors that closed as soon as I approached. It was as if an invisible label had been stuck to my forehead. Guilty. I wondered if they all really believed I had sabotaged the project, or if it was just easier to pretend they didn't see. No one wanted to get involved, and I understood fear lived here too. Still, it hurt. Every step through the hallways was a cruel reminder that my reputation, built with so much effort, was slipping through my fingers. I started eating lunch alone, working with headphones on all the time, trying to create a bubble where the judgment couldn't touch me. But the silence around me was deafening, heavier than any direct accusation. I didn't need them to say anything. The emptiness spoke for them. With each passing day, I felt my place there fade a little more. The feeling of abandonment consumed me slowly, but I couldn't afford to give in. Not yet. I had to resist. I had to believe that someone, at some point, would dare to look at me with humanity, and that faint hope was what kept me on my feet that week. The silence of my colleagues was deafening. On Friday, as I was finishing my tasks, I heard footsteps approaching my station. It was Jessica, the data analyst, always quiet and observant. She handed me a report but lingered, as if she wanted to say something. When our eyes met, I saw something different. Hesitation and guilt? Or was it empathy? Her face carried more than just numbers. She sat in the chair next to me and was silent for a few seconds. Then, she cleared her throat, crossed her arms and looked at the floor. She didn't just seem uncomfortable. She seemed scared. I asked if there was a problem with the data, trying to lighten the mood. But she shook her head. She was there for another reason. I shouldn't be saying anything, she began. But, there's something you need to know. I felt my heart race. Her tone was low, almost a whisper, as if someone could hear us, even amidst the sound of keyboards around us. I held my breath, trying not to show the turmoil inside me. I asked her what it was, but she just shook her head. Not right now, she said, standing up. And she left with hurried steps, leaving the report on my desk. I remained still for a few seconds, as if that moment had suspended time. I didn't know what she meant, but I was sure it was important. She looked at me and said, "There's something you need to know." All weekend I kept replaying that moment. Jessica's look was stuck in my head. There was truth there, or at least the promise of it. On Monday I tried to approach her, but she seemed to be avoiding me. Always busy, always in a hurry. I started to fear that she had regretted it, that she was being pressured to stay silent. At lunch, I went to the break room hoping to find her alone. When I finally did, I sat next to her. I asked if everything was okay, and she just nodded. I didn't want to push. I just said that if she wanted to talk, I was available. She sighed, mumbled an almost inaudible, "I know," and clutched her coffee cup in her hands. "It's complicated," she said after a few minutes. "There's a lot at stake." I saw the fear on her face, but also a spark of indignation. It was as if something inside her was fighting to emerge, but didn't have enough strength yet. I didn't press her. I just thanked her for listening. When she stood up, she looked at me for a brief moment and shook her head, as if she were deciding something internally. She left without another word. But that gesture, that look, it gave me hope. Maybe she knew something that could change everything. And maybe she was still looking for the courage to act. She looked scared but willing to help. That night, I received an email from her. "Let's talk." We arranged to meet outside the building, in a discreet coffee shop, away from prying eyes. Jessica arrived 10 minutes late, visibly anxious. She sat down and took off her glasses, massaging her temples as if she had been carrying the weight of a secret for too long. I ordered 2 coffees, but she barely touched hers. Her hands were cold, trembling slightly. "Thanks for coming," I murmured. She nodded but remained silent for a few long seconds. She looked around carefully, as if she feared being followed. I began to wonder if I was putting her at risk, but she was the one who had insisted on the meeting. Her expression was a mix of fear and determination. Something had changed inside her, and I needed to hear it. Finally, she leaned forward. "I can't stay silent anymore. I've seen this kind of thing happen before, and no one did anything. I don't want to repeat that story." Her voice was firm but quiet. I looked at her with all the calm I could muster. "Then talk, Jessica. I'm here." She took a deep breath and bit her lower lip, struggling with words that still seemed trapped. And then before she said anything, she stopped again. She observed the room, the people around us, even the street through the window. She was clearly torn between the urge to tell me everything and the fear of the consequences. And I understood. I had felt it too, the fear of being seen when you speak the truth. She was nervous, looking all around. "It was last week," she began finally. "I stayed late at the office, finishing a data extraction for Project Y. I was on the server when I saw Michael enter the technical coordination room. I thought it was strange because it was almost 10 at night, and he never showed up there alone. My heart started to race. I knew something important was coming." Jessica looked at me, and her eyes filled with uncomfortable memories. The door wasn't completely closed. I saw him open one of the Project X documents on the server. Then, he used credentials that weren't his. It looked like a test account. He was in there for almost 20 minutes. Every word she spoke seemed to pierce the veil of doubt I still had. "Are you sure about what you saw?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm sure," she replied without hesitation. "I saw the file name. It was the timeline. And when he left, he looked pleased. It gave me the chills. But I thought maybe I had misunderstood. Until all this happened." Jessica clasped her hands in her lap as if trying to protect herself. I took a deep breath, trying to process it. That explained the strange hours, the inconsistent data, the metadata. I had fragments, but she was giving me a crucial piece. Something that could become proof if I knew how to investigate it properly. The problem now was figuring out how to turn her testimony into something concrete and undeniable. "I saw him, with my own 2 eyes," she said. "I went home that day with my mind racing with ideas and possible paths. I needed to act quickly but with precision. I could no longer rely only on records saved on my machine. Now I had a witness. And I needed to protect her while seeking irrefutable technical proof. Michael was too smart to leave visible tracks. I took an old notebook and started listing everything. Times, dates, altered files, saved versions, who was at the company at each moment. I created a parallel timeline, cross-referencing Jessica's data with mine. Each point of intersection was a potential focus for investigation. It was like putting together a puzzle under pressure, knowing that the final image could save my career or destroy it. The following Monday, I arrived at the company early. I went straight to the IT department, hiding my nervousness. I needed to find a way to access the internal logs, something that would prove the unauthorized nighttime access. I knew it would be difficult, but there was someone who might be able to help me, even if he didn't know it yet. Before that, however, I gathered everything I had and prepared a folder with partial evidence. It wasn't much, but it was the start of something. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of hope ignite. Michael may have started this dirty game, but I would no longer be a passive player. I was ready to fight back. If I wanted justice, I would have to see it through to the end. Everything was starting to make sense, but I still needed more. That morning, I sat in front of my computer with a clear mission: to revisit every system, every folder, every old trace that might contain evidence of what Michael had done. I started with the local backup files, the ones the system saves automatically when there are changes. Some old versions were there, but they were incomplete, truncated. Still, I saved everything to an encrypted flash drive. Slowly, I delved deeper into the system, trying to find forgotten directories, temporary files, and activity logs. There was a lot of data, and most of it seemed irrelevant at first glance. But I couldn't risk ignoring anything. Every detail could be the missing piece. The complexity of Volteca's system required patience, and I was willing to give it. I reviewed access records linked to Project X and compared them with my entry times. What intrigued me most was the overlap of access at unusual hours. Although I couldn't see who used the system, it was clear that someone had done so during periods when I wasn't present. I took screenshots of everything with dates and times. I was starting to build a technical trail, albeit a fragmented one. But most of the truly critical information was beyond my access level. To move forward, I would have to rely on someone who had the keys to the system. Someone who understood the company's internal structure and could go beyond the surface. It was risky, but I knew who to ask. Every click was a new hope or a new frustration. I took a deep breath before entering John's office. He was the IT coordinator, an excellent technician, but always suspicious. I knocked on the door and walked in with a restrained smile, holding the folder with everything I had gathered so far. He looked at me with a raised eyebrow, as if he already knew this wouldn't be a casual conversation. I sat down and got straight to the point, without beating around the bush. I explained calmly that there were serious inconsistencies in the Project X files, and that I believed someone had manipulated them. I showed him the logs, the cross-reference times, and mentioned Jessica's observation, but without directly involving her. He slowly leafed through the papers, analyzing each item with a trained eye. But in the end, he dropped the folder and crossed his arms. "You want me to investigate this without authorization?" he asked seriously. "Yes," I replied firmly, "because the truth is being covered up. And if I don't do something now, my reputation will be destroyed." He watched me in silence, as if weighing not just my words but my integrity. The tension in the air was palpable. "Why do you want all this?" he finally said, his tone a mix of curiosity and resistance. And right there, at that moment, I realized that what I needed wasn't to convince him with proof, but with conviction. I needed him to believe in me more than in the papers. "Why do you want all this?" he asked, suspicious. I looked John in the eye with honesty. I said it wasn't just for my career, but for the truth. That I couldn't accept being made a scapegoat by someone who used his position to manipulate everything around him. That, despite my fear, I was willing to face the consequences. I saw a slight change in his expression. He leaned back in his chair and sighed. "You've got guts, Amy," he said, almost in surprise. "But this is serious. If anyone finds out I'm helping you, I could get into big trouble." I agreed. I knew the risks, but I also knew that without help, I wouldn't get anywhere. The silence stretched for a few seconds, until he leaned forward and picked up the folder again. "I'll take a deeper look. See if I can find anything in the internal logs, especially the nighttime access." My heart raced. It was all I needed. Not a promise, but a chance. He continued, "I can't promise anything, but I'll try. And if I find something, we'll decide together what to do." I nodded, grateful. I didn't expect guarantees. I just needed someone on my side. And there, for the first time in days, I felt that maybe I wasn't fighting alone anymore. It was just the beginning, but it changed everything. "I can't promise anything, but I'll try," Maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. 2 days later, John discreetly called me into the IT room. He closed the door, turned off the hallway light, and showed me his computer screen. I managed to restore some automatic server backups, the ones hidden in old partitions, he explained. My heart sped up before I even saw the content. He opened a directory and pointed to a series of files dated before the Project X alteration. I clicked on one of them, and there it was, my original version, with all the correct dates and none of the modifications that incriminated me. He compared it with the current version on the system, the altered one, and opened a technical comparison panel. The differences were clear. More than that, the digital signature had been overwritten by a manual action, which left traces invisible to the naked eye but detectable by someone like John. These records aren't accessible to regular users, he said, turning to me. Only someone with administrator privileges could do this. My blood ran cold. It was exactly what I had feared and needed to prove. Michael, with his privileged access, had meticulously manipulated everything. But now finally there was a breakthrough. John crossed his arms and looked at me seriously. "This changes everything," he said, his eyes wide. "This changes everything," he said, his eyes wide. I left the room with an encrypted copy of the files, my hands sweating. The first person I thought of was Susan. If there was anyone on the board with enough sense of justice to listen, it was her. I waited until the end of the workday and knocked on her door firmly, but with my heart pounding. She received me with surprise and a slight weariness in her eyes. "It's important," I said. "It's about Project X." I handed her the folder with the documents and explained, in detail, how the files had been tampered with. I showed her the comparison between the versions, the access logs, and the times that coincided with Michael's presence at the company. I mentioned Jessica's testimony without revealing everything, protecting her identity for the time being. Susan listened to me in silence, reading each page carefully. The tension was almost unbearable. I didn't know if she would take me seriously or dismiss it all as a desperate defense attempt. But I stood firm, making it clear that all I wanted was justice. When she finished reading, she rested her hands on the desk and stared into space for a few seconds, as if she needed to digest everything before reacting. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she took a deep breath. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she took a deep breath. Susan stood up and carefully closed the office door. She sat down again and faced me with a look that mixed surprise, restrained anger, and something deeper, empathy. "This is very serious, Amy," she said in a low voice. "And if it's true, it can't be ignored." I nodded, relieved that she hadn't dismissed everything immediately. "What do you plan to do?" I asked. She answered slowly, weighing each word. "I can't take this straight to Robert right now. I need to confirm the data, cross-reference it with the board's records, and make sure we're not walking into a trap." I agreed. The last thing I wanted was to be rash. Susan was cautious but also fair. And at that moment that was all I needed. "I'm going to need some time, and maybe some more information," she added. "But please don't talk about this with anyone yet. Not even Jessica. Not even John." She knew how much I wanted to see this through to the end, but there was something in her firmness that made me trust her. If anyone knew how to navigate the backrooms of power, it was her. Before I left, she looked me in the eyes firmly. "Leave it to me." Those words, simple and direct, were like a blanket of relief on my tired shoulders. For the first time, someone with an active voice was on my side. "Don't tell anyone yet. Leave it to me." There was a real chance, but everything could also fall apart. The changes in Michael's behavior started subtly, but were obvious to anyone paying attention. He began to watch me more from a distance, avoiding direct conversations and maintaining a less confident posture than usual. He seemed suspicious, like someone who feels they've lost control of something they thought was secure. In every meeting, his voice sounded more tense, his arguments more defensive. It was as if he sensed that something was about to surface. I noticed he started reviewing documents more frequently, requesting old files and rereading minutes from past meetings. This wasn't routine, it was a desperate attempt to check where he was vulnerable. Susan, for her part, kept a neutral expression, but her eyes were always alert, gathering everything like someone silently putting together a puzzle. Me? I just waited. The game was in motion. On a gray afternoon, I ran into Michael in the hallway. He smiled but without his usual sparkle. "You've been busy, haven't you?" he commented as if casting a line. I just nodded, trying to hide my racing heart. He stepped a little closer and said in a low voice, "Do you think you can take me down?" That froze me inside. But I kept my cool. I didn't answer. I just met his gaze without fear for the first time. Because deep down he already knew. The truth was closer than ever. "Do you think you can take me down?" he asked with a cynical smile. Meanwhile, Jessica made a brave decision. Knowing about Susan's growing involvement, she finally gathered the courage to give her a folder with old screenshots, prints that showed legitimate versions of the files, before the alterations. These were images Jessica had saved as a precaution, long before everything came to light. They were dated, authentic, and incredibly incriminating. She scheduled a meeting with Susan, who received her in her office cordially but reservedly. Jessica was visibly nervous, trembling slightly as she handed over the documents. "These are backup copies I saved when I realized something strange was happening," she explained. Susan leafed through the material carefully, her eyes narrowing as she analyzed every detail. It was more than she had expected. "These screenshots confirm the original timeline," Susan said, almost to herself. "And they show that the changes came later, in an unauthorized manner." Jessica nodded, unable to hide her fear. "What are you going to do with this?" she asked, her voice trembling. It was clear that the weight of this delivery affected her deeply. She was putting her integrity on the line. Susan didn't answer right away. She just placed the documents in a discreet folder and thanked her with a slight nod. Jessica left without looking back. She knew that, from that moment on, there was no turning back. "What are you going to do with this?" she asked, trembling. The next day, Michael was called into Susan's office under the pretext of a routine conversation. She had prepared everything with precision. The files, the logs restored by John, the screenshots provided by Jessica. When he entered, he still tried to maintain his usual confident posture. But as soon as he saw the documents on the table, his expression changed. Control was slipping through his fingers. Susan was direct. She pointed out the inconsistencies, the access records, and the cross-reference data. She presented the evidence like someone who knows exactly what she's doing. Michael tried to interrupt, to suggest there were misunderstandings, but she didn't allow it. For every one of his arguments, Susan responded with a fact, with proof, with a technical detail impossible to dispute. "This evidence has been verified and cross-referenced with internal IT records," she said firmly. "It shows deliberate manipulation, misuse of credentials, and alterations that directly compromise your version of the facts." Michael leaned back in his chair, his face pale, but still trying to maintain his composure. He smiled nervously and tried to downplay it. "That's one interpretation. There could be technical errors." But his voice no longer carried any weight. Not in the face of the solid facts. He was cornered and he knew it. Michael turned white, but he tried to keep his composure. "It's out of my hands now, Michael. The CEO will decide." Susan handed Robert a folder with all the evidence, accompanied by a technical summary prepared by John. The meeting was brief but intense. The CEO showed no surprise, just a cold concentration, like someone who had been expecting something like this to come to light. He sat alone in his office, with the documents open in front of him, going over them line by line with a calculated slowness. Nothing escaped his pragmatic gaze. Outside, I waited in silence, along with Susan. Time seemed to stand still, and the tension in the air was almost palpable. I knew he wouldn't make any rash decisions. Robert wasn't driven by emotion, but by data and results. And, at that moment, the evidence against Michael spoke for itself. Still, my heart beat erratically. He called us back in 20 minutes later, with the same impassive tone as always. He thanked Susan for organizing the documents and asked me to remain silent while he analyzed a few more details. Then he took off his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and said that this required an official meeting. With everyone. Tomorrow 10 a.m. Boardroom. That was all he said before ending it. I stood up from my chair with trembling legs. I had been expecting this. But now that it was happening, the fear was even greater. His brow was more furrowed than ever. The news of the meeting spread like a silent wildfire. No one knew exactly what it was about, but rumors began to fly in every corner. It was rare for the CEO to gather so many people for an extraordinary meeting, and on such short notice. The looks directed at me increased, but this time they weren't just of judgment. There was doubt, expectation, and maybe curiosity. The next morning, I arrived early and watched the activity in the executive hallway. Susan arrived with her restrained expression. Jessica also appeared, tense but determined. John passed by me with a discreet nod. When Michael entered, the air seemed to grow heavier. He was serious, his tie perfectly aligned, but his clenched jaw betrayed his true state. The room filled up slowly. One by one, the members of senior management took their seats. Robert entered last, closing the door with a sharp click that made everyone straighten their posture. He didn't greet anyone. He sat at the head of the table and opened the same folder of documents. He paused for a long time, as if he wanted the weight of the moment to settle on all of us. Then he said, "We are here to clarify serious facts that involve the integrity of our system and the reputation of people on this team." No one moved. The air felt trapped. For the first time, Michael didn't smile. The silence in the room was like glass about to shatter. The night before the meeting, I slept very little. In fact, I just closed my eyes between one thought and another, sitting on the edge of the bed. I mentally reviewed all the data, every conversation, every risk. I asked myself if I had missed anything, if I was ready, if I had really done enough. But I also knew there was no turning back. Whatever came next was out of my control. I prepared my clothes as if I were dressing for a battle. I chose something discreet but professional. I didn't want to seem fragile, nor arrogant. I wanted to show with every gesture that I was there for the truth. And despite the fear, I stood tall. I knew I would have to face not only the eyes of the board, but the disappointment of those who had believed the lie. That's what hurt me the most. I took a deep breath before leaving the house. The city was overcast, the sky gray, as if reflecting the doubt that weighed on me. As I entered the company building, a shiver ran up my spine. Jessica was waiting for me near the meeting room. She touched my arm and said, "You're not alone." Those words were all I needed to not fall apart. But even with proof, witnesses, and courage, there was still fear. Because the power was still in their hands. Even with everything, I was still afraid. That morning, I didn't know if I would walk out with my name cleared or completely destroyed. The tension in the boardroom was almost palpable. Everyone was there. Directors, coordinators, analysts, and of course Michael. Each person avoided looking directly at another, as if any gesture could reveal what was not yet known. Robert opened the meeting with few words, reaffirming the importance of ethics and transparency in the company. His voice was controlled, but there was a definitive tone to it. Michael was the first to speak. With his usual rhetorical skill, he tried to take control of the narrative. He said that although there were flaws in Project X, everything had been resolved internally. He reinforced that he had always valued excellence and trusted his team. He even praised me, as if that could soften any accusation. It was a performance, and he knew it. For a few minutes, it almost seemed like he was succeeding in manipulating the room's perception. Some faces showed confusion, others doubt. I remained silent, waiting. Then, Susan stood up calmly and distributed folders with copies of the evidence. And without warning, she looked at Robert and said, "I believe everyone should see the video now." Michael tried to interrupt, but Robert made a hand gesture, signaling for silence. Control finally was slipping from his grasp. Michael was still trying to maintain control of the narrative. The projector was turned on, and the room was plunged into partial darkness. The video, retrieved by John from the security camera backups, clearly showed the technical coordination room at 2:17 a.m. The image was sharp enough to recognize Michael entering in a hurry, looking around before accessing the computer. Absolute silence in the boardroom. Then, the recording showed him logging into the system with an administrator account and opening the Project X file. For nearly 20 minutes, he edited data, changed deadlines, and saved the document. The screen reflected in his eyes, which now looked so different from the man who had been speaking just minutes before. There were no technical excuses here, only deliberate action. Jessica, next to me, discreetly held my hand. I could feel my heart pounding in my neck, the air trapped in my chest. Finally, the video showed him leaving the room, with a slight smile on his face. That was the raw, undeniable truth, without distortions or interpretations. What we had felt was now a fact. The video ended. A heavy silence fell over the room, and with it, a definitive shift. The truth could no longer be ignored. The sound of the clicks, the video, and the raw, unvarnished truth. No one spoke for the first few seconds. Michael remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the table. Susan, with a firm posture, said, "Based on these records, I believe we have sufficient proof of deliberate manipulation." Robert, still silent, slowly closed the folder in front of him. His silence was more eloquent than any words. The mood was one of shock, but also of relief. One of the directors from the legal department asked if this had already been formally reported to compliance. Susan confirmed that it had. Everything had been filed the day before, with copies stored in a secure location. I kept my breathing steady, but my eyes began to well up. Not with sadness, but with accumulated exhaustion. From a weight that was finally beginning to lift from my shoulders. Robert stood up, looked around at everyone and said, "Measures will be taken. What we have seen here today does not align with the values of LTech Solutions." Then he looked at Michael and said only, "You are relieved of your duties until further notice." Michael didn't react. He didn't argue. He just closed the folder in front of him and remained still. Susan looked at me with tears in her eyes. Robert was silent. Susan looked at me with tears in her eyes. Robert was silent. Michael left the room in silence while all eyes were on me. He said in a solemn tone. He then stated that the company had reviewed all the evidence and that I had been unjustly accused. He apologized on behalf of the board and affirmed that my reinstatement was not just formal. It was an acknowledgement of the injustice. That took me by surprise. I hadn't expected such a direct apology. Susan, beside me, nodded with a slight gesture, as if to say, "You won." I couldn't contain my emotion, but I maintained my composure. It wasn't the time for tears. It was time to take a deep breath and finally start over. For the first time, I heard applause in the room. It was timid but sincere. Each clap sounded like a piece of my dignity being returned. His words were few, but each one carried weight. On the same day, the company released an internal memo announcing the immediate suspension of Michael Brown. The note stated that he was under investigation for unethical conduct and manipulation of internal data. It was corporate language, restrained, but for those who knew the truth, every word was a direct hit. The man who had controlled narratives for so long was now facing his own truth. There was no farewell ceremony, no thank you emails. He left just as he had entered that last meeting, in silence. It was said that he had tried to argue, to threaten, but it was no use. The evidence spoke louder than any speech. Jessica confirmed that he had tried to contact her after the incident, but she didn't respond. It was too late for any redemption. John remained at his post, discreet, but with a different posture now. I felt that, even without many words, he had been on my side from the moment he decided to help. The team, once cold, now showed a sort of quiet respect. I was no longer the nice coordinator who accepted everything. I was someone who resisted, and won. Michael was now out, and, for the first time, I wasn't the one who feared the future. Now he would face the consequences, alone. After everything, I was called by Susan to discuss my future at the company. She made it clear that if I wanted to leave, I would have her full support, but she also said that if I wanted to stay, I would have the freedom to rebuild. I took a deep breath. There was pain, yes, but there was also purpose. I decided to stay. Not out of attachment, but out of a sense of mission. I wanted to do something bigger with everything I had been through. I then proposed creating an internal program to support women in hostile work environments. Susan not only approved but was moved by the proposal. "This is what we need here," she said. We started structuring workshops, listening groups, and awareness campaigns. And little by little, I realized that my role there had completely changed. Jessica began to help me with the program's initiatives. She also seemed more confident, more assertive. Our conversations were no longer whispers of fear but plans for change. I saw other women come forward, sharing their experiences. And there, Amid stories and reconstructions, something new was born in me. The certainty that my pain would not be in vain. It was the end of one cycle and the beginning of another. My pain became my strength, and I would never be the same again. Months have passed since that day when everything came to light. The company was no longer the same, and neither was I. I was invited to officially lead the new internal program for ethics and integrity, focused on preventing abuses of power, data manipulation, and promoting a safe environment. I accepted with a heart full of purpose. Every meeting I led, every presentation, every training session was a chance to transform the place that had almost destroyed me. The most surprising thing was seeing how people began to open up. Professionals from different departments started sharing situations that would have previously been hidden out of fear or shame. I created support groups, listening panels, and educational campaigns. More than teaching processes and conduct, I spoke about my story, and that resonated. It generated empathy, change. Silence gave way to conversation. I was invited to represent LTech at a national conference on corporate governance. I presented our program with pride, highlighting that ethics aren't born from manuals, but from difficult choices. I received applause, but the greatest recognition was seeing other professionals say they wanted to bring that to their own workplaces. For the first time, I felt that my story was making a difference beyond just myself. Teaching what I had lived through was liberating. Jessica, for her part, blossomed impressively. Her timid demeanor gave way to a quiet but firm confidence. Susan recognized her courage in a board meeting and proposed her promotion to coordinator of the data analysis department. It was approved unanimously. She had been the first to break the silence, the first to risk herself for justice. On the day of her promotion, I organized a small celebration for her. I saw tears in the eyes of colleagues who had previously ignored her. It was as if they were finally seeing who she had always been. During my speech, I said just one sentence, looking directly at her. Her courage saved my career. She smiled, moved. It was well-deserved, and it was just the beginning. We started working more closely together, united not just by a common story, but by a shared mission. I saw in her a reflection of what I had needed to become. Someone who faces fear and chooses the truth. Our partnership grew, and with it, new projects began to emerge. Together, we were stronger, and we knew it. Her courage saved my career, I said with pride. Sometimes, alone in my office, I close my eyes and go back to that morning when I was accused. I still feel the chill down my spine, the crushing silence of the hallways, the empty stares of the people around me. But today, when I open my eyes, I see a different Amy in the mirror. A stronger woman, more aware of her own worth. I didn't become this person in spite of the pain, it was because of it. I learned that justice rarely comes easily. It requires confrontation, patience, and sometimes irreparable losses. But I also learned that there is no scar that cannot teach. What Michael tried to erase in me became the very thing that shone brightest, my integrity. And no one can take that away from me anymore. What began as an attempt at destruction became a seed of reconstruction. My name no longer carries fear. It carries respect. And when someone comes to me to tell their story, I listen with the same attention I once wished others had given me. Because I know what it means to be disbelieved. I know what it's like to have your voice silenced. But now, I also know what it's like to be heard. What destroyed me also built me. Now I knew exactly who I was, and no one would silence me again. Now, I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Support the channel by subscribing, liking, commenting, and sharing this video. I'm leaving another story on the end screen that you'll also enjoy, and it will definitely surprise you. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.